Hey, my name is Joey. So glad you've joined me. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor at the Block Church. We are based in Philadelphia, and I really have a passion and a compassion, a heart for leaders who lead in hard places. That's really kind of the theme of these leadership conversations, is leadership in hard places. And today, I want to talk to you about self-care for leaders. Especially if you are leading in a hard environment, a challenging climate. If you're a Christian leader, pastor, it's really important that we grasp and understand how to lead while also taking care of ourselves. So that's the title today. Need to know, need to practice leadership, self-care. I want to start Matthew chapter 14, verse 10. And we'll talk through a little bit of how Jesus handled challenges. So here we go, verse 10. So John was beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a tray and given to the girl, who took it to her mother. Later, John's disciples came for his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus what had happened. Now, I know that's a challenging way to start out a leadership conversation, is somebody getting beheaded. But that's not exactly where we're going. There's hope. But a little context here. Jesus and the disciples, they're doing great ministry. They're moving, they're traveling, they're in the meat of it. John, who's a relative of Jesus, whom he's close to, who baptizes him, he's arrested. He's calling out this individual, this leader who is not living right. And he says, enough's enough. He makes a commitment. He beheads him. It breaks the heart of Jesus. Here's what you need to know. First and foremost, the dichotomy of experiencing God's blessing and hearing difficult news, they walk side by side. Right there. Jesus is doing ministry. He's loving people, he's healing people, he's going about doing exactly what he came here to do, and then he hears the news of John's death. Now, of course, Jesus had foresight, he was God, he knew it was coming. It still hurt him. Now, if Jesus knew it was coming and it still hurt him, imagine how alarming and challenging it is for some of us who, when bad things are coming, we don't know they're coming, and how much it throws us off. Here's what we need to practice. Knowing that bad and challenging things are going to happen, we also need to practice gratitude and thankfulness for what we have or still have and are still doing. So as leaders, how do we self-care? Well, we need to know that there's a dichotomy of experiencing God's blessing and hearing difficult news. They walk side by side. At the same time, we've got to practice our gratitude and our thankfulness that we still have something to do and God is still doing great things among us. I can't tell you how many times in the midst of leading our church, we'd come off a great weekend, God would be doing great things, we'd have a great financial month, new people would be coming, and then it would feel like almost immediately we'd get a letter from a venue that we were renting that would say, hey, we feel like our time is coming to a close and you've got to find another place to go. There are things in leadership that are opposing us all the time, especially in difficult places where we see gains, where we see momentum, and then all of a sudden, these potentially momentum stoppers hit us. Of course, we have to leverage those momentum stoppers for momentum. Of course, that's another talk, but the point is, what do we do when that stuff happens? What do we do when we hear bad news? Instead of griping, instead of moaning, instead of staying in bed for a day, although grieving and being sad is important and it's necessary, our response has to be thankfulness and gratitude that we still have something to do and God will provide another way. In verse 13, the Bible says that as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was and headed and followed him on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowds as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and he healed their sick. Here's what you need to know. The pressures of ministry and the needs of people, they never end. They never end. Jesus is going, he's trying to get away, he's trying to sneak away to pray, to rest. And what happens? The crowds surround him, and then in his compassion, he then ministers to them. Here's what we need to practice when that takes place. We've got to stay compassionate and tenderhearted even when feeling defeated. Bad things are going to happen. Bad news at some point will come our way. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to allow it to make your heart hardened? Are you going to be cynical? Are you going to be frustrated to the point where you cannot then minister, love, care for people? You need to know that the pressures of ministry and the needs of the people, they never end. They walk side by side. So if you're going to stay healthy, you've got to stay compassionate and tenderhearted, even when you're feeling defeated. Again, I could go through thousands of scenarios where maybe there would be disappointment, or there would be pressures, or there would be challenges, or the phone would ring, or the text would come in, and I would be feeling a sense of depletion. People leave your church, people go, right? You're depleted. But the important thing is, what am I doing to get in God's presence, to read, to stay fit emotionally, spiritually, physically? I have to find a way to stay compassionate and tenderhearted when I'm feeling defeated. Verse 22, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back in the boat and across to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. Okay, now pay attention here. Jesus, he heals the sick, then they feed the 5,000, and then after that, he immediately sends and insists the disciples that they've got to get back in the boat and cross to the other side while he sends the people home. After sending them home, he goes up into the hills to pray. Night fell, and he was finally alone. Pay attention to what Jesus does here. Pay attention to the progression. He's going about his business. He's doing ministry. He's got his team. He hears bad news, but the pressures of ministry and the needs of the people continue. So he pushes a little bit more. He pushes a little bit further. He heals them. He feeds the 5,000. They do something miraculous. But then Jesus hits a point where he's like, okay, enough's enough. I've got to get alone, and I've got to recalibrate. I've got to recover. And I got to connect to God. So here's what you need to know. Your limits. You got to know your limits, or when you are near your limits, or when you are redlining. And when I say redlining, I really am talking about when you are driving a car and you're hitting a point where your RPMs, you're redlining, you're about to burn out and blow up. You got to know your limits personally, while you got to know yourself. And you got to know when you're near or when you're redlining. I have a staff member who is great at this. He knows when he's starting to hit that point where I've got to get some rest. And what he does is he communicates it ahead of time. He says, I'm feeling this. It's coming. I need some rest. I've learned over the years what I've needed to recover. I need silence. I need stillness. I need time with God. And I can tell when I'm getting to my point, but it's a practice. It's something learned. You don't know it right away. It's easy to burn out, but you got to know yourself. You got to know your limits. Here's what we need to practice, okay? We need to practice discipline, solitude, and personal edification. As leaders, particularly leaders who are leading in hard and challenging places and scenarios, if you don't learn to get some discipline, solitude, and personal edification, you will not make it. So what do? Every morning, I get up a little extra early. I have the same rhythm. I go down to my office in my house. I get my coffee. I have my 2 books. I read a certain amount of those books every day. I pray. I have personal quiet time before I have my son jump on me and my wife instruct me, or I get text messages or phone calls or emails. This is the first thing that I do because I know it's the only way that I can function at a level where I can keep compassion. You need to learn discipline. And as I feel this rumbling and this inability to keep going, as I feel exhausted and burnt out because of bad news or because I'm overwhelmed or even good things are happening, I've got to get solitude. I know myself. It's important for you to know yourself, know your limits. You got to practice discipline, solitude, and personal edification. You got to be listening to other preachers. You got to be listening to leadership talks. We've got to invite and engage other people. I believe it's Peter Scazzaro who has great practice on emotionally healthy spirituality, and he has this practice. He calls it the daily office, where multiple times a day you still yourself and you pull away to quiet yourself and say, okay, I'm recovering and I'm returning so that I can keep pouring out. I love what Mark Driscoll says. This is amazing. He says this, he says, solitude is meeting with the Lord. Isolation is a meeting with the devil. And leaders, oftentimes, when burnt out, when frustrated, instead of gaining solitude, we isolate. Instead of leaning into other people, instead of prayer, instead of going on the mountain to meet with Jesus or sneaking away to the beach for stillness, we isolate, we neglect, we don't talk, we don't communicate, and all of a sudden, an opportunity to get connected and have solitude with God turns into an isolated meeting with the devil. Verse 24, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from the land, for a strong wind had risen and they were fighting heavy waves. Verse 25, about 3:00 in the morning, pay attention to that, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. About 3:00 in the morning. I think it's really important that you understand that Jesus didn't come right away. Jesus handled his business before he went and handled the business of the disciples. Now, no doubt about it, Jesus sent them away. He sent them into that. And so I want to be clear, especially theologically, that God sometimes leads us into a place of challenge, of wilderness. In fact, the scripture said that before Jesus fasted, the Spirit led him into the wilderness. So Jesus might lead us into some challenging, trying moments. And even as you're leading people, you might lead people into opportunities where they've got to have some challenges so that they grow. However, here's what you need to know. You are not or shouldn't be the reason for the crisis of those you lead. Okay, you're not the reason that someone's in the middle of a crisis. You might be the reason that you give them a little bit of a challenge, that you're growing and developing them, but you're not the reason that they are in a crisis. Often people create their own crises. Actually, all the time people create their own crises, people that you're leading, working with. And you don't always have to bail people out right when they need you to bail them out or when they need you to handle it. Sometimes they're managing the chaos, they're learning in the midst of the winds and the waves, how to respond and how to call on God and how to get the right help. Here's what you need to practice. Come to people when you're ready or send somebody else. Come to people when you are ready or send someone else. Now, I get it. There are going to be emergency situations, and there are going to be urgent situations, and you've got to use your emotional intelligence, which I do a talk on, the emotionally intelligent leader. You can find that. You got to use your emotional intelligence. However, most of the time I've found that if I pause and if I wait, individuals will figure out how to handle the problem for themselves. And if I come and I try to minister from a place, if I try to care from a place, if I try to answer from a place of complete depletion, they're not getting the best of me. And instead of helping them figure out what to do for themselves, I'll often go and do that for them. And I then cripple them and not empower them, I enable them. And so what I'm saying is this, is just because you're available, it doesn't mean you'll be beneficial. Just because you're available, it does not mean you'll be beneficial. You got to make sure that you are whole and do what you've got to do to self-care so that you can lead in hard places. Verse 27. But Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here. Here's what you need to know. He finally comes to the water. Here's what you need to know. Confidence calms your community. You walking in confidence because you edified yourself, it calms your community. Here's what you need to practice. Confidence comes from clarity. If you don't wake up, if you don't get your own peace, if you don't think clearly, if you are not rested, it's hard for you to bring about the clarity needed to provide the confidence that they need to lead them to the next place, to lead your organization, to lead your staff, to lead your team, to lead yourself to the next place. You get clarity, then you get vision, and from vision comes confidence. And when you've got confidence, you calm your people. And as I close this verse part of it, and I'll give you a few suggestions, verse 26, When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." Verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed Peter. "Oh, you so little faith," Jesus said. "Why do you doubt me?" When they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. Then, verse 33, then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. Here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to know. Okay, remember the disciples had got finished feeding 5,000 people. They just got finished. Jesus broke the bread. He gave it to them. Then he said, "Now you give it away." They were the miracle. They were the miracle. And what happens? Just a few moments later, they're freaking out because they think a ghost is walking on water. Even though Jesus said, "Go, I'll catch up with you," did they not expect it to be him? Here's what you need to know. People are fickle and praise is fleeting. 1 minute, you're the king. 1 minute, they love you. 1 minute, they got your back. 1 minute, they're with you. You empowered them. They fed 5,000 people. And then the next minute, they're doubting you and freaking out. Jesus goes, "You of little faith." You got to know people are fickle and praise is fleeting. Here's what you need to practice, okay? You need to do what you do for God's glory, not man's approval. Because if you're constantly trying to do stuff to prove to people you're good enough, to prove to people you are who you say you are, to prove to people your title, if you're constantly trying to do stuff for man's approval to fill a gap and a hole in your life that should be filled by God, not somebody else, then you're gonna get in trouble. You're gonna end up in an affair. You're gonna end up burning out. You're gonna end up doing stuff that's only gonna hurt the people around you, the people that you love. We do what we do for God's glory, not for man's approval, because people are fickle. And 1 minute they love you, and then the next minute they hate you. We love them, and we're doing it to see them empowered, but we're doing it for God. We're doing it for our purpose. We're doing it for the mission of our organization, not for man's approval. So what are some real self practices? And then I'll review everything. What are some real self-care practices? Here's some things that I do that I hope to help you. Number one, we should Sabbath weekly. Absolutely Sabbath weekly. We know what Hebrews says in chapter 4, verse 9. It says this. It says, "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience." If you don't rest, you're going to burn out, get in trouble, and get in a sin. Period, the end. You got to Sabbath weekly, 1 day a week. Here's my flow. Usually on Fridays, at about 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock, I'm finished. I do nothing and then Saturdays after dinner, I might take a look at my notes to preach, but oftentimes I just get up real early on Sunday mornings and I begin to dive back into work. I give myself 24 hours or more. I Sabbath weekly, and I hold on to that for dear life. If you don't plan your day of rest, your lack of rest will take you out. You've got to plan it. You're more susceptible to sin, failure, and burnout when you don't rest. Here's number two. You got to communicate regularly. I told you about my staff member who knows when it's coming. He communicates regularly. Burnout is usually the fault of those who don't communicate and ask for help. Talk about where you're at with your accountability and your leader. If you don't have accountability, if you don't have a leader in your life, if you're a senior pastor or senior leader, you still need another senior leader in your life to lean into. Ask for advice regularly, okay? Sabbath weekly, communicate regularly. Here's number three. You've got to practice your health consistently. I know it's hard. I know it's challenging. I've changed the way I eat this year because this was affecting me. 1 Corinthians 6:19. The Bible says this, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body." You've got to practice your health consistently. Number four, you've got to have fun monthly. It's important that you Sabbath weekly. 1 day, guard it with your life, get some rest. right? If you miss a week, catch up, maybe get yourself 2 days the next week. You got a Sabbath weekly. But I think it's important to strategically be fun monthly. That could be with your team. It could be with your staff. It could be with your spouse. You got to do something that's going to make you laugh. It's going to make you forget everything, shut down. I really encourage, go have some fun, do your hobby, do something significant outside the norm monthly. And number 5, my encouragement, this is what we do. We vacation semi-annually, which means we try to 2 times a year get away. One might be for spiritual purposes, more prayer, more receiving, more solitude. Another would be fun, relaxing, nothing. But I encourage you the best you can, even if you've just started your church, even if it's early on in your business or your ministry, I want to encourage you, vacation semi-annually. It's important 2 times a year to connect with yourself and those you love. All right, let me review, okay? Self-care for leaders, what we need to know, what we need to practice. You need to know that the dichotomy of experiencing God's blessing and hearing difficult news, they walk side by side. You need to practice gratitude and thankfulness for what you have and what you're still doing. You need to know that the pressures of ministry and the needs of people, they never end. You need to practice staying compassionate and tenderhearted even when feeling defeated. You need to know your limits, or when you're near or you are redlining. You need to practice discipline, solitude, and personal edification. You need to know that you are not or you shouldn't be the reason for the crisis of those you lead. You need to practice coming and rescuing or leading or empowering when you are ready, or send somebody else. And you need to know that confidence calms your community. You need to practice and understand that confidence comes from your clarity. I hope that helped. Oh, I forgot one more. You need to know people are fickle and praise is fleeting. You need to practice. Do what you do for God's glory, not man's approval. Okay, I hope that helped. My goal is to help lead others and empower others to lead in hard places. It starts with your self-care. You can do it. God's with us. Best is ahead.